Hello. Thank you for coming after your coffee break. If you want to keep it really cozy, I encourage folks to come to the front of the room also if you want to have a more cozy interaction. Welcome to Uncovered, the hard truth about OTel's vendor neutrality. My name is Adriana Villela, and my clicker has decided to not work. Oh, why is it not working? One sec. Sorry. Clicker issues, my bad. I had two clickers for my earlier talk, and I think I got the receivers mixed up. So my name is Adriana Villela. I am a CNCF ambassador. I'm also a blogger, podcaster, and I spend my life in the OpenTelemetry world. I'm one of the OpenTelemetry community managers. I am also a maintainer of the OTel end user SIG, and by day, my day job is as a principal developer advocate at Dynatrace, and at night I like to climb walls. I actually checked out one of the bouldering gyms here in Athens on my first day. It was super cool. I love traveling to different cities' bouldering gyms whenever I go to a conference, so that was super fun. I also love capybaras. They make me happy. I normally give this talk with Josh Lee, and unfortunately he couldn't be here today, so this is a solo endeavor, but I assure you it's just as entertaining. Now, this topic actually started a while back. I think it was sometime last year. And Josh posted this post here on LinkedIn talking about OpenTelemetry vendor neutrality. And I was thinking, you know, I bookmarked it and I thought, I have some thoughts on this. I need a response. And so I wrote a blog post in response to his LinkedIn post. And then we got to talking, and he said, hey, do you want to submit a talk together about OpenTelemetry vendor neutrality? You have opinions, I have opinions. Let's see what can come of it. Do we have anything more to say? And of course we do. Here we are with this talk. Now, the main gist of what we're talking about is that standardization is good. And you know, we live in a world full of standards. My favorite standard, for example, is USB-C. I'm old enough to be of the era of whenever you got a new cell phone, even if it was from the same vendor, you would have a new charging cable every single time. And then you ended up with a drawer full of charging cables, and it was super, super annoying. Does anyone out in the audience have their favorite standard that they would like to share? Don't be shy. Yell it out. Yes. Sorry? Beyond OpenTelemetry, any standard. XML, okay. Anyone else have a favorite standard that they like? Okay, well, as you can probably guess, my favorite standard also, besides USB-C, is OpenTelemetry. This is a shout out to, there's a brand in, I'm originally from Canada. I'm originally from Brazil, living in Canada. I've been living in Canada for 35 years. And in Canada, we have this brand called No Name, and it's literally just yellow products, and it tells you the name of the thing. So if it was flour, it was be a yellow bag of flour that says flour. So OpenTelemetry, lovely standard. I thought it was a great way to express really the what OpenTelemetry is all about. And you know, in terms of OpenTelemetry's history, it exists because of distributed tracing. Because before distributed tracing, you know, we didn't really need to have so many standards. We were pretty self-contained within our the languages that we wrote our code in, right? We'd have these monoliths, and they were all written in the same language, all .NET or all Java. And then distributed computing kind of changed everything, and now we end up with these applications that are written in multiple microservices, sometimes in different languages. And so now we need a standardized way to be able to express how is it that we're going to trace a call from A to B that's going through microservices that are of different languages. So what is our common language for that? Now, there were a few attempts in the past to achieve that standardization. And actually, I'd say the best attempts were probably Open Tracing and Open Census, which were precursors to OpenTelemetry. But in the past, especially, each vendor, there were your traditional monitoring vendors, and each vendor had basically their own APIs and SDKs that you would have to implement in your code in order to get some form of, I will say, observability, because it was kind of pre-observability, it was more monitoring. And if you decided you didn't like that vendor anymore, you were kind of screwed, and you had to deal with also their own proprietary agents. You couldn't really break up with your vendor easily. And then OpenTelemetry comes along, and now we have this lovely standard for being able to do our distributed tracing, and it opens up a lot more doors for us. And so OpenTelemetry gives us open data formats. It's obviously distributed computing friendly, and most importantly, it is vendor neutral. So now if you want to break up with your vendor because you hate them, you're not stuck with them, because that was the problem. It's like you're stuck with this vendor even though you hate them so much, but it's so much effort to go back and rip out all that old instrumentation from that code and having to rewrite everything all over again. Super frustrating, not very practical, and very expensive, right? Not just from cost, but also from labor, right? A developer has to do it. Someone has to do it. Now, in terms of what makes OpenTelemetry neutral, I would say in a nutshell, it's this idea that you don't have to re-instrument your code if you're using OpenTelemetry. So if you're switching from vendor A to vendor B because you want to break up with vendor A, you don't have to go into your code and rewrite all of that instrumentation, right? Because the process of instrumenting code is already basically technical debt, right? You're writing code. You're adding code to your code so that it becomes more observable, but of course you can introduce errors. So this minimizes that. Now, in a more granular level, OpenTelemetry is vendor neutral because of the following components. First of all, we have semantic conventions, we have the API and the SDK, we have OTel P, and then we have the OTel Collector, and I'll go into these in greater detail. Now, remember, I told you we had the no-name brand in Canada with the very generic, very obvious labels. This is an example, literally from my pantry. So semantic conventions in OpenTelemetry, think of them as your standardized labels for your telemetry. So metrics have their own set of standardized labels, traces have their own, logs have their own. So this is great because it's a common language. It's not something we have to consciously add to our telemetry because it's given to us free with purchase, if you will. And also because we have these standard semantic conventions, that means that we have kind of this common language across microservices, right? And it's similar to the labels in your food, right? If you're looking at nutrition labels, these are all different products, right? Think of these as different microservices, but what do they have in common? They have the same label that looks the same. They tell us how much sugar there is, how many fats, how many carbohydrates, etc. The next thing is the OpenTelemetry API. Now, the OTel API you can think of as the entry point into your telemetry. So it defines the methods for the instrumentation. So it's the what. And there is basically an OTel API for each language supported by OpenTelemetry, and there are tons of languages now being supported by OpenTelemetry. I would say the ones with the most love are probably Java and .NET. There's PHP, Python, .NET, PHP, Python, Go, Rust, JavaScript. I think Erlang even. So there's a lot supported by OpenTelemetry. And then we have the SDK. So if the API is the what, the SDK is the how. It actually tells us how we're instrumenting that code. And the cool thing about the SDK, so it implements the API. And the idea behind it is there's an official OpenTelemetry SDK, and but you don't have to use it. You can actually write your own SDK, or some vendors even write their own vendor-specific SDKs. But as long as they implement the API, you're fine because it's not going to break your code, which is wonderful. And you don't even have to commit right away to an SDK. The API actually has a very bare minimal implementation of the SDK. So if you're not ready to decide which SDK you want, it's not going to break your code. It's not going to emit any telemetry, but it won't break your code, which is huge when you're writing your code, especially when you're compiling. You don't want those compile time errors, right? Next, we have OTel P, which is the secret sauce of OpenTelemetry. OpenTelemetry, all this telemetry, whether we're receiving it or sending it out, we need a transport mechanism for that telemetry, and that's OTLP, or the OpenTelemetry protocol. And then my personal favorite, which is the OpenTelemetry Collector, often referred to as the Swiss Army knife of OpenTelemetry, because it does so many cool things. It allows you to ingest data from multiple sources, whether it's application telemetry or infrastructure telemetry. It allows you to process your data, so you can basically do batching, you can add and remove attributes, you can mask your data, you can do sampling, and then you can send your telemetry to one or more destinations. And we'll get into why that is important. And in a nutshell, the collector gives us this thing called interoperability. So it gives us this flexibility. Vendor neutrality really is all about giving us choices. So what do these choices look like? For example, it's very common to have a setup where your OpenTelemetry collector can send your telemetry to different tools. Maybe you have one vendor that you really love for traces, one that you really love for metrics, and one that you really love for logs. And you're able to do that with OpenTelemetry because it lets you send telemetry data to multiple destinations at the same time. Or perhaps you have found your dream vendor that accepts all of the telemetry signals, but maybe you're between two dream vendors. So then you might want to send your same telemetry to vendor A or vendor B. They seem to do the same thing, but you're not entirely sure. So what you can do is basically do a vendor bake-off and see how they fare, right? Which one does the better job of really helping you understand what's going on in your system? Another scenario is basically where you have a vendor backend, but you might have a compliance requirement whereby you have to keep your data for 7 years. Now, you probably want to keep that in some sort of storage on premise, either on your private cloud or on your public cloud. That's not necessarily associated with your observability vendor, because maybe you might want to change vendors in the future, so you want to have that flexibility. And maybe you don't need to send all that data to your observability vendor, but like, for example, logs you might want to store for long-term storage in case, right? So that's another scenario. And then our final scenario is one where maybe we have different teams that are using different tools. And a common scenario of that could be, for example, maybe you are there is an enterprise sanctioned observability tool that everyone is using, but it's limited mostly to the SRE team. But maybe your developers would like to leverage that OpenTelemetry, the OpenTelemetry data that they're emitting in their code. They want to be able to troubleshoot it. So maybe you send it to a local tool for rendering the telemetry data instead, if you don't have access to that enterprise license. Or another common scenario is, say you have a company A acquires company B, and guess what? They both use different observability vendors. So some teams are going to be on vendor A for a while, and some teams are going to be on vendor B for a while. But all of this goes to show that we have a lot of flexibility when it comes to OpenTelemetry. And so it really means we have that interoperability, which means having your cake and eating it too. Now, keeping all that in mind, having all that lovely flexibility, it's also important to realize what you're going into when you are switching vendors. Because oftentimes we have this temptation, the boss is like, hey, it's going to be a lift and shift when we switch vendors, right? Easier said than done. And your SRE team's like, not exactly. It's not as straightforward as you would want it to be. That doesn't mean that, it's impossible. It's absolutely very possible, but I think it's important for organizations to really understand what it means to switch vendors. if you're instrumenting your code with OpenTelemetry, because it isn't a straight lift and shift. We have things such as look and feel. Whenever you switch vendors, there is going to be a different UI, because guess what? There is no standardization on UIs. That's one of the things that makes vendors distinguishes vendors from one another, right? Because they want to stand out. Hey, maybe their UI is more usable for one person, and perhaps it's more usable for another person. So you do have to learn how to navigate that new UI. In addition, queries and dashboards. Perhaps you spent a lot of time that you invested creating queries and dashboards in your previous vendor. When you switch vendors, it becomes a little bit tricky, because you're going to have to recreate all those dashboards. You might have to learn a brand new querying language. That can be that's a bit of a learning curve. Not impossible, but it's something to keep in mind. Fortunately, I will say I would say a lot of observability vendors have MCP servers, and I think that helps to make things a lot easier, because you can have natural language interactions with them, and some of them will even give you guidance on, like, hey, I want to create a query for blah, blah, blah for this vendor. And so they will give you that guidance, and they'll help you write that query, which makes things a lot easier. So I think the picture of it is a lot, I think, more optimistic than it was even a year ago because of that. Alerts and SLOs, that's another thing. You spent all this time creating alerts and SLOs for your current vendor, and now you're going to have to do the exact same thing with your other vendor, or maybe that new vendor doesn't support alerts and SLOs, and you're going to have a secondary vendor just to deal with alerts and SLOs, something that you have to keep in mind. And then infrastructure as code. Many observability vendors have Terraform providers that allow you to automate a lot of stuff, such as managing users. Some of them let you do. Some of them let you create dashboards and queries, but not all of them have the same functionality across vendors. That is not standardized. It's just up to that vendor to determine what they want to provide. So if you have infrastructure as code written for vendor X and you switch to vendor Y, you're basically going to have to rewrite that Terraform code from scratch. That's unfortunately how it is. But again, I think with the help of AI, we can really help to accelerate that. And then finally, storage and historical data. As I mentioned earlier, one of the scenarios for that highlights the interoperability of the OTel Collector really is that ability to send the same telemetry to multiple destinations. And so you can send your logs for long-term storage for compliance reasons. And that's that can be extremely important. That one can be a tricky one too, because, for example, some vendors, if you switch vendors and perhaps your old vendor doesn't allow you to pull your old data from them for compliance reasons, then that means you're basically stuck paying for that vendor, at least for your historical data, until that time expires. And so I would highly, highly recommend always have some sort of like S3 bucket or similar storage, either in public cloud or private cloud, for that compliance data, so you don't get surprised with that, because otherwise you can find yourself paying for basically two vendors even after you make the switch. So something to keep in mind. Now, in terms of, I think this shows that everything OpenTelemetry is basically vendor neutral until it hits the back end. So one of the things that Josh and I talked about is, what would it look like? Is it even possible to have that fully vendor neutral vision of the future? Because right now, basically, the first box on your left shows basically the stuff in blue. All that stuff is brought to you by OpenTelemetry. That's the vendor neutral stuff. The OTel Collector is vendor neutral because it in itself is a vendor neutral agent. So it replaces that vendor specific agent. So really what's not so vendor neutral is the backend stuff, the dashboards and the queries and the storage and the alerts. So the question is, can that happen? Now, interestingly enough, there are some vendors that provide that bit of like vendor neutrality, and these are some of them. And just to give you an idea, some of them are under a foundation, some of them are not. There would be some mix and matching involved. It doesn't give you necessarily an all-in-one solution, but if you want to go fully vendor neutral, it is an option for you. But at the same time, I do work for a vendor, so maybe I'm going to be a little bit selfish and say, but what if, as another possibility, also a particular vendor could expose their database through an API, so then you can use it to query the data, you can use it to send data to the database, you can use it to query the data, and maybe, it does maybe 95% of what you want it to do, but maybe for that 5% you want to slice and dice the data in different ways, and maybe you want to send that to another data store that can do that analysis for you in a different way that your favorite vendor doesn't provide to you. So wouldn't that be kind of a cool thing for vendors to be able to do, to expose their databases through APIs like that? We might not be there quite yet, but I think that could be an exciting possibility for the future. Now, keeping all that in mind, in spite of some of these challenges, OTel is awesome. When you think about it, we were thinking hard when we were talking about this talk. We were reminded of this XKCD comic about how you create standards to consolidate standards, and all you end up doing is having more standards, right? That's kind of what it felt like a little bit with USB-C and Lightning for a while. But OpenTelemetry kind of transcends all that. We end up in a situation where OpenTelemetry as a standard kind of squashed all the other standards. Like when OpenTelemetry was formed, there were two competing standards before that, OpenTracing and OpenCensus, and OpenTelemetry resulted from the merger of OpenCensus and OpenTracing. So unlike this comic, it actually superseded that, so which is really cool. Now, why is OpenTelemetry successful? First of all, it is open. It's a very collaborative community. I would say there's the OpenTelemetry community is very mindful to not have egos in the room. Everyone's very thoughtful. I've been in tech for 25 years now, and I didn't submit my first pull request until 2022. That was like my very first open source contributions. And in spite of having and I was 16 years as a Java developer, I've coded. And in spite of that, I was still terrified to submit my first pull request to OpenTelemetry, because all I could think of was those mean Stack Overflow guys who are like, what are you, some kind of idiot? And everyone was super nice. They were very helpful, and so it kept me wanting to contribute. And now I'm a community manager of OpenTelemetry. I'm one of the maintainers in one of the SIGs in OpenTelemetry. So it just goes to show it's a very welcoming sort of community, and it tries really hard also to remain vendor neutral. I'd say that's one of the superpowers. It does not allow, even though I actually work day to day with people who are so-called competitors within OpenTelemetry, who are co-maintainers, and yet we don't see each other as competitors. We're all working towards the same goal, and I think that's really the true power of OpenTelemetry. Now, in terms of how this benefits you, is that it makes it portable, because you do have that ability to switch vendors if you want to break up with your vendor. You get that interoperability through the magic of the OTel Collector, being able to ingest data from multiple sources, being able to send data to multiple destinations. And at the end of the day, it does give you choice. And so it results in the ability for you to ask meaningful questions, get useful answers, and take action on what you've learned. And now I'm going to leave you with some useful resources if you want to check them out. I've got a link to Josh's original LinkedIn post on vendor neutrality, my blog post in response to his LinkedIn post. If you want to learn more about observability with OpenTelemetry, I have an O'Reilly video course on the subject, if video is your jam. And I'm always looking for end user stories for the OpenTelemetry end user SIG. As a maintainer of that SIG, we're looking for how people are using OpenTelemetry in real life, to be able to share their stories, to share how they to share any cool stuff that they've learned. So if you'd like, we've got a couple of podcasts through the OTel end user SIG. So if you'd like to share your story, please reach out to me. I'm on CNCF Slack. And I also, as I mentioned, I have a podcast called Geeking Out. And as I said, I love capybaras. The capybara is the part of my logo. My daughter designed the logo for that. And I've had some really cool people in the observability space on the podcast, including Charity Majors and Liz Fong-Jones. From the cloud native space, I have had Kelsey Hightower, on there. And from the developer community, I've had Ixchel Ruiz, I've had Aisha Lafia, who I hear are no strangers to the Devoxx conference circuit. And most recently, I've had Microsoft's Scott Hanselman. So I've had some really cool guests. We really talk about tech origin stories, keep it very human. And then finally, here's my contact info. Once again, you can download the slides from the QR code on this slide here. Very meta. Thank you so much for hanging around, and enjoy the rest of your day. And happy to take any questions since we do have some extra time. But if not, you can also get some extra time back. Oh, question, yes.
Thank you. So, is there a, how to say, a feature or a description of OpenTelemetry framework or standard on how to handle like information like PII data or security sensitive stuff, or how to mask them, or usually the responsibility stays to the system that emits this information?
So in terms of giving you the ability to mask the PII data, the OTel Collector has I want to say it's a processor. I want to say it's the transform processor. I can get back to you on specifically what that is, but it's definitely a processor in the OpenTelemetry collector. In terms of what you decide to mask, obviously that's going to really be up to your organization, but it does, I would say the README docs for that processor in the OTel Collector do provide some guidance around how to go about it. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you again. Appreciate it.